Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm creating cozy camp vibes using die cuts with texture. This is the Summer Camp collection from Spellbinders. We have the Woodland trio as well as the Trailside trio. These characters are absolutely adorable, perfect for summer camp cards. This is the Splash Days die set, perfect for different water themed pieces. And then we have the Camp Days die set. These are great accessories to add to both the Woodland trio as well as the Trailside trio. This is the Trails End die set, which is so great for adding little details to your scenes. We have the Summertime Sentiments stamps. Look at all of those sentiments in that set. And then we have the Lakeside Memories stencil set. This is perfect for background scenes. I'll be using that in several cards, but not all of them. I'm going to start off by creating a bunch of sentiments for my cards. Now, I've used this stamp set before, so I don't need to use my white eraser on it. Typically, when I have a new clear stamp set, I use a white eraser to remove any possible manufacturing residue and then clean it up with a brush so that it's ready to take some ink. Now, like I said, I've used this before. I will share with you the card that I've used or that I used with it because it's using the summer camp set and it's absolutely adorable. I'll share that at the end of the video. Now I'm just putting all of these sentiments on some Hammermill cardstock. I'm going to heat emboss them with some distress embossing glaze for just a bit of a colored sentiment. You could use any color you want. I wanted them to kind of fit the woodland or the summer camp vibes. So I'm putting a bunch of sentiments on here using my Misty stamping tool so I can stamp it multiple times. I like to heat emboss the sentiment so that I have that extra little bit of texture, but you certainly could just use ink and just stamp them with plain ink if you want. Again, I like heat embossed sentiments just because it adds that extra little bit of texture, that little bit of raised and glossy texture. I find really finishes different cards up and just adds that extra little bit to it. So I'm using vintage photo distress glaze. Another one would be peeled paint distress glaze for that summer, for that woodsy vibe. I think would be great as well. But I thought the vintage photo would suit all of the cards that I'm creating. Then once I've poured the excess off, put it back in the jar. I'm using my heat tool to melt that powder, making sure that it is all melted before I trim it down. Now these sentiments don't have dies to them, so I'm just going to be using my guillotine trimmer to trim them down to create some sentiment strips. And I like to do this at the beginning of my project so that I have them all ready to go. So when it comes time to assemble my pieces, I have all of my sentiments ready to go, ready to just grab and add to my cards. So I'm using my guillotine trimmer and I use that clear finger guard there as a bit of a guide when I'm cutting my sentiments down. I'll have the bottom or the top part of the sentiment just showing on the right side of that guard. I try to make sure that it's nice and even. Then I flip it around for the other side, trying to make sure that that is even as well before cutting off the ends. For my first card, I'm going to be creating the raccoon, and I'm going to be using it with the Splash Days to create the canoe as well as the oar. These pieces have a lot of pieces to them. They probably take a lot longer to die cut than they do to assemble, but the thing with having die cuts with a lot of pieces, it just adds so much extra texture, so much extra detail, and I really think it enhances the finished product. So what I like to do to take away some of that overwhelm is I organize them on my piece before I start to assemble them. I have them all laid out so that all of my pieces are close to where they are supposed to end up, and then I just start to assemble one bit at a time. Now for this particular one, I'm using some Anchor cardstock as well as Fawn Cardstock for the base of the raccoon. For that white piece, it is velvet cardstock that has an adhesive background. However, before I die cut those pieces, I do like to put scrap cardstock on the back and then die cut them. It just gives them a little bit more oomph to them, and they're really easy to die cut. It die cuts just like regular cardstock, but for the rest of my animals, I'll be using most of that velvet cardstock just for that extra little bit of texture. I love using velvet cardstock when possible for animals, for like sweaters, scarves, just different things that would naturally have a fuzzy texture to them. I think it adds some extra interest to the card when you have different textures to them. So the one thing to know about velvet cardstock is you just have to let it dry for just a little bit longer. It dries totally fine. I still use my liquid glue. but it just takes a few extra seconds to dry. And when I say a few extra seconds, probably like 30 seconds to a minute. So it's not just 1 or 2. Because that glue soaks into the velvet first and then it starts to set. So you do want to be a little bit more patient with it and let it dry for just a little bit longer. But it does add extra detail to it. I know when I create cards that have velvet on them, that's the first thing people do is touch the velvet because people love things with different textures to them. So it enhances it a lot. So once I have my pieces together, you can see that I have the top and the bottom, my raccoon, done separately. Then I'm going to start working on that life vest. I have a new toolkit from Spellbinders. It's called the Crafty Handy Toolkit. It has 2 different tools with wax tips as well as the replacement pieces for those wax tips. So you can pick and choose which wax tip is best for you for whatever it is that you prefer for working with. Now, I like to use it for small die cuts to lift them up and put into the glue that I already have on there. You can see that I don't use them for everything. When you use dies like this that have layering pieces to them, especially with Spellbinders ones, when you do your die cutting, it adds little indents showing you where those upper layers are intended to go. And for the die cuts that have that, it makes it really easy to know exactly where you're going to put your glue. Then you can use that wax tip to just lift the piece and place it exactly where it's supposed to go, and it makes the assembly really, really easy. The other parts of that tool set are some tweezers, which also helps with smaller die cuts, as well as a piercer. So once I have my raccoon done, I'm just using a little bit of hickory smoke around the outside edges. You can see that I don't use a lot. You could do the ink blending ahead of time, but you get a lot more ink on those pieces. And I just want a little bit, just a touch of it. I don't want to cover it completely with ink. On my canoe, I'm using a little bit of vintage photo distress ink so that it looks like it's a canoe that's been used, been worn a little bit, has a little bit of visual dimension to it. So I'm putting those pieces aside and I'm going to use that stencil set to create my background. I have a piece of Hammermill Cardstock here that is 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. With these stencils, there are little corner marks on the stencil showing you exactly where the edges or where the corners of a 4¼ by 5½ inch piece of cardstock should go. Then I'm using my distress inks to fill in those areas. This first layer, I'm using peeled paint. I'm heavier on the bottom, lighter towards the top where the sun would hit the hills a little bit more. For the second layer, we have a line of trees, and I'm going to be using some forest moss. Now, this is the only background that I'm stenciling on screen. I'm creating a couple more of them for different cards, and I'm going to be doing those off screen. I do them in the same way. However, you could change it up. For this particular one, or for all of my backgrounds, I'm using some weathered wood as well as faded jeans on the sky as well as the water. If you wanted, you could add some colors to create a bit of a sunset. I chose to keep them fairly simple because the die cuts themselves have a lot of detail, have a lot of layers to them. I decided to keep my backgrounds very simple for all of the cards. I start off with that weathered wood being a little bit darker towards the distant water and a little bit darker towards the upper edge of the sky. Then I go in and just darken those areas with the faded jeans distress ink. I want a little bit of visual dimension in those areas, and I find that having some areas lighter, some areas darker creates that. For the last layer here, and I took my stencil off a little bit too soon, for the moon or the sun, I have used some scattered straw distress ink, and then for my sand area, I'm using some vintage photo distress ink, and I'm being a little bit darker towards the edge of the water where the water would hit the sand than I am towards the bottom. So with our background done, we're ready to start trimming things and creating our card. So for this particular card, I'm using some Anchor cardstock. I have that trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches for my mat. For my stencil piece, I'm taking 1/4 inch off of each side and trimming that down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. And I do find that it's easier to stencil the entire piece first, and then you can trim it down. You can trim it so that you have some areas, like say if you want to see that sun or moon more, you could trim more off the bottom and the sides and not have it half cut off like this. You could also make this piece a little bit bigger and your mat just a little bit bigger and have more to that stenciled background. When I'm adding my die cut pieces, I'm going past that stencil background as well as my mat. I just think it looks a little bit interesting for these cards. Sometimes I'll stay within those pieces or within those areas, but for some cards, I just think it looks interesting to have them going out just a little bit. And I thought these ones, I wanted to have that extra space. So I glued my canoe down, then I glued my raccoon, and then finally the oar in the raccoon's hand. Lastly, I'm adding that sentiment towards the sky. Now I wanted my water, because we see a decent amount of water on this card, I want it to be sparkling. So I'm just adding little random bits of stickles on there. I'm not covering it completely. I don't want the entire thing to be glitter. Just adding random lines so it looks like the sun glittering off the water. And then for my eyes and nose, I'm just adding a little bit of glossy accents. It's just going to add that clear domed dimension to it. You want to make sure to let that dry completely. It'll probably take about a half an hour to dry. Probably a little bit less, but I like to err on the side of caution. Then I'm going to sit that aside to completely dry. For this next card here, I am creating the fox. Now I have some orange velvet cardstock here, and it's a little bit too bright for my liking. I want it to be a little bit browner on, or more on the brown side. So I'm using some coffee archival ink in order to go around the edges and the top of that velvet. Now just know that archival ink takes a little bit longer to dry. If you happen to have some brown StazOn ink, that likely will dry a little bit quicker. I don't have any, so this was the next best thing. It will dry, but it probably takes about 20 minutes. According to the back of the pad, it says that it dries on non-porous surfaces, which I would kind of classify the velvet cardstock as whatever that fiber is, probably non-porous. So I would give it probably a good 20 minutes to dry. Now you can wait until you glue it together to let it dry. I will just use the same finger on there to hold things in place. And I did find that I got a little bit on my fingers because I didn't wait for it long enough, but I didn't transfer it anywhere else. Once it was all assembled, I didn't find that I had bits of ink where I didn't want them to go. If you want to err on the side of caution, you can wait for it to completely dry, but this is a great way to just alter the color of velvet cardstock a little bit if it's not the exact color tone that you want. So once again, I'm gluing the pieces of velvet together, and the white pieces are also velvet cardstock. I'm putting different parts of those together, letting them dry, and then I'll continue the assembly. But just like the last one, I put all my pieces together, the pieces that are supposed to go with each other. It just makes the assembly really, really easy, knowing that you have all of those pieces there ready to go. For my little fish, I'm using some pieces from solid hot foiled prism foil. When I do my foiling with my glimmer system, I will regularly use my solid hot foil plate. Sometimes I'll use those pieces for the cards that I'm creating. Sometimes I'll use them for the front or focal images for cards. Often I'll use them for mats on my cards, and sometimes I'll just set them to the side and put them with my specialty cardstock. This was a piece that I put with my specialty cardstock. It works perfect for a fish because of that holographic nature to it. So I put that on the end of my fishing rod, continue to glue my fox together, and now we can let that completely dry before assembling our card. So I'm adding the fishing rod to his hand there so that that can dry as well. Once again, you have to be just a little bit more patient, but it's so worth it to have that extra little bit of texture from that velvet cardstock. For the mat for this card, I'm using some Fern Cardstock. I have that trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Once again, I have another stencil background that I did off screen, exactly the same as the first one. That is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now we're ready to add our little fox with the fish there, as well as our little trees in the background, just to fill it out a little bit. I added a little bit of Forest Moss Distress ink that was on my brush, but because I'm using Fern Cardstock for those trees, you really probably can't see it. It's probably a waste of time, but in my mind, it made sense. So that is something that you could miss unless you have a lighter green for your trees. And I definitely would add that little bit of ink blending because we have that ink blended background. We have the ink on the fox. I think it totally suits it. Now I'm also going to be doing some glossy accents for the eyes and the nose for this. However, be a little bit more cautious when you're using velvet cardstock. So when I put that glossy accents there, I'm not having it extend all the way to the velvet cardstock. That velvet cardstock is just going to absorb the glossy accents and you're going to get a weird drying mark in there. So I'll just put it on the cardstock on the inside of those eyes, not having it go all the way out to the edge just for safety purposes. With one of my future pieces, you'll see how I fix that because for that one, I went just a little bit too far, and I just use a thumbtack to fix it. So it is possible to fix it, just be aware of that. For the next one here, I'm going to create the skunk. Now for the first two, as well as all of the last three of my cards, for the eyes, I used white on the background, and then the eye pieces were die cut out of black. But because we're creating a skunk here and he's black, if we did the eyes black, they would get lost there. So I am using white for the eye pieces, black for the background pieces. This is velvet cardstock, so we've got some black and white velvet cardstock here. Once again, putting all of my pieces around, organized, so they're ready to go, so that I know that I have everything that I need to assemble them. For this one, I'm using the little tennis racket as well as the tennis ball. I thought it would be cute to have the little skunk playing tennis. For the splash days as well as the camp days die set, there are so many different accessories that you can put with these pieces or with these little characters. I used the life jacket on that first one. There is also a swimsuit that is absolutely adorable, and swim trunks. For the sports ones, there is archery. I'm going to use that on one of the pieces. There is all sorts of different pieces. So I'm using some of them, but I'm not using every single one. I wanted to show a good variety and have my little characters doing different things. And for these cards, I'm just using one character per card. I'm creating an A2 card. For the card that I'm going to show you at the very end, it's one that I did for the Pear Blossom Press channel. It's not live yet. I will add a link to it or in the description once it is live. It is using 2 characters on a card. If you're using more than one, I probably would make my card just a little bit bigger. So these ones are all A2 cards. I'd probably do a 5x7 card because to give it enough space for those 2 characters, because they do take up a little bit of space, but they are absolutely adorable. For this one, I'm not using that stencil set for the background, although you could if you wanted. I wanted to create a background that was just really, really simple, so that it really highlighted my skunk with the tennis racket and tennis ball. So I'm just using some hickory smoke towards the bottom of the cardstock, some weathered wood, as well as faded jeans towards the top. So it looks more like a, say, tennis court, but like fuzzy, like not detailed or anything, just kind of a hint of something that's not necessarily a lake behind there. But like I said, you could use that lake stencil. I just didn't want to use it on every single card in this video. I'm using some poppy cardstock for my mat here. I have that trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Obviously, you could see this is where I die cut my canoe piece out of. My background here is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and then we can add our skunk to it. So this one is going to be a much simpler card than some of the other ones with all of the pieces. So you can use this set, this collection, and just create some really simple cards. You don't have to use all of the accessory pieces if you don't want to, but they definitely do add to the uniqueness, to the funness of this collection, as well as adding to those cozy camp vibes that you can create with this collection. So here is the final result. I love that extra texture that velvet cardstock creates. I can't stop touching it often when I create cards with it. So once again, adding that glossy accents to the eyes as well as the nose. Now, I think this is one of the ones where I got some of the glossy accents a little bit too close to the velvet. So I use the thumbtack in order to clean it up. I just kind of go right around the outside edge, make sure that there is a space between that glossy accents as well as the velvet. The other thing is, if when you're squeezing that glossy accents, you get a little bit of a bubble, you want to pop that bubble with a pin before you allow it to dry. If you leave it there, it will dry right in that glossy accents. It's really easy to fix. Just poke it with a pin and it usually pops. Now for my next card, I'm going to be using, I'm going to be creating a squirrel. So I have that orange velvet once again, and once again, it's a little bit too bright for my liking. So I'm using that coffee archival ink. I will let that dry for a little bit while I'm assembling my other die cut pieces. I'm using the Trailside die set for my little sign with all of the sentiments on it, or to create the sentiments. So I love the fact that you can just create regular camp signs if you want, or you can create a sentiment with it, and that's what I'm doing for this particular card. Now, I'm using this set or this collection to create cards, but you could easily use this. I think this would create such a fun scrapbook page or like mixed media piece. I think you could have a lot of fun with it because there's so many different details with all of the different sets. For this one, I'm adding the little hat as well as some shorts. So in the Camp Days set, there are shorts, there is a shirt as well, and there's also a backpack. Some of my characters I will add those details to. Some of them I'm leaving them off. So you can add them to your characters or you could leave them off. I think they look cute either way, and I wanted to show some of them with and some of them without. So after I've let my pieces for my squirrel dry for just a little bit, we're ready to start assembly. And you can see I use that wax tool for some of the smaller pieces. It really works well with some of the cardstock pieces or some of the smaller cardstock pieces. It doesn't work well for velvet cardstock, so those tiny pieces I will be using with my fingers in order to lift them and put them into that glue and position it that way. Now, between the Woodland Trio and the Trailside Trio set, we have 6 different animal characters. I'm creating 6 cards total, so I can create a card with each one of those animals. I wanted to see them all done and wanted to share them all done. And for most of them, I'm using that velvet cardstock aside from the raccoon at the beginning. And that was mainly because I didn't have any I didn't have 2 tones of gray to use to create them. However, you can easily use just regular cardstock. You don't have to use velvet cardstock for this. I just love the way it looks. I love the extra texture it gives. And I think it really enhances the card, but it's absolutely not necessary. So I don't want you to think that you need velvet cardstock for them. I just wanted to share that idea, and it's one that I've shared a decent amount. It's something that I've done regularly, so it's not something new that I've done or discovered, but I wanted to share that with you if you hadn't known that that was a thing, that it was a great way to add some texture to the different pieces to it. So once I have my little squirrel done, I can add, or I can assemble the little lantern and have that ready to go. And with that done, we're ready to start adding the clothing as well as the little accessories to our squirrel. Now you may have noticed I didn't add the back to the hat. We want to add the front of the hat to the squirrel first. I'm going to add the shorts as well as the boots, and then I'm going to let it dry for a few moments. The back of the hat goes behind the squirrel's head, so it looks like he's actually wearing the hat rather than a hat just kind of sitting in front of him. So we want to wait a little bit for that. And again, because we're gluing on velvet cardstock, we're just going to wait a few extra minutes than what we would normally wait. I'm using some Fern Cardstock for a mat for this piece. So that was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And once again, I have a stenciled background that was created off screen, same as that very first one. That was trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So our squirrel has sat for a few moments and dried, so we can add the back of the hat to him before we start to assemble our cards. And you can see once we have our little characters and our accessories assembled, the card assembly process is super easy. If you wanted, you could assemble your squirrel or your other animals on top of your card, but I like to assemble them off, so then when I'm doing the assembly process, if by chance I put that piece where I think it would go, I might not like it once I have the whole thing together, or there might be something in the way that I didn't think of ahead of time. So I like doing them off screen so that I can adjust the positioning to make sure that I have it positioned how I want it and how I think it looks proper. Then I can add my sign to our background as well as our little squirrel there. I just love that little background. I think it's absolutely adorable. Years ago, or a couple years ago, there was a background stencil set for a nautical or a sailing themed collection. I think that would be a great background for this as well. If you happen to have that, that would work here as well. So once I have the card assembled, I can add my glossy accents to the eye as well as the nose. And I did get a bubble there, so I was popping that bubble before cleaning the glossy accents up with that thumbtack to make sure that it didn't have contact with my velvet cardstock. And then we can set that aside to completely dry. For this next one here, I'm going to do the deer. I'm going to assemble the deer. And I'm going to have him playing some archery. So we have the little bow there and we have the arrow. The arrow is die cut out of some silver or matte finished silver cardstock from the Silver Treasured Cardstock pack. These are another great way to add different textures to your pieces. And I thought it made sense for the arrow to have some metal to it. So that I just did out of the matte because I didn't really want the shiny finish to it. But the silver treasure or the treasure cardstock packs, it comes in a bunch of different colors, has different finishes to them. So you can pick and choose which finish works best for what you're creating and the look that you're wanting. So for my target piece here for the archery board, the target thing, I have the inner layers of that. I just put the glue right in there. I'm just using that wax tool to pick up those pieces and lay them properly in place. Then I can lay that nice and flat. And I want it to look like my character just shot an arrow into it. So I'm going to glue the arrow right to it. And then I'm going to set those aside and assemble my deer. And by now you can see that the assembly process is really quite simple. For all of them, I just lay all of those pieces out and I just assemble the pieces one at a time. They come together really quickly. And like I said before, the die cutting process takes longer than it does to assemble them. But I do know, especially for people that are new to layered die cuts, the amount of die cuts for these pieces, it can get a little bit overwhelming. But by having them like this laid out, it takes that overwhelm out of it. These are velvet cardstock pieces. Once again, we have some tan, we have some white, and we have some darker brown. But again, you can just use regular cardstock if you want. For my eyes and my nose, it's just regular black cardstock. We don't need anything fancy for that, especially because I'm adding that glossy accent for that little bit of domed glossy dimension to it. We added the belly to the bottom part as well as the arms. Now the deer has little hooves for the ends of his arms and the ends of his legs. So I'm adding those. Those were die cut out of some dark velvet cardstock. But again, that could just be just regular cardstock if you didn't want that velvet texture to it. So once I have these pieces together, we can add the head to the body and then let that sit and dry for just a few moments. And then we're ready to assemble our card or create our background for our card. This is another one that I just created a really simple background. I didn't want to have all of that lake detail behind it because it's archery. I didn't think it would make much sense for the target part to kind of be in the lake with that stencil background. So all I'm doing is I'm just using some Hammermill cardstock and I'm going to create a very simple blended background with some peeled paint distress ink on the bottom, some weathered wood on the top. I do like to make sure to go a little bit darker around the edges. I think it just frames it in a little bit. And I'm just blending between the green and the blue. I use the weathered wood and then the faded jeans just to darken some of those areas. But again, it just creates the suggestion of, say, being in a field creating or doing some archery rather than needing something that is super detailed, because we have all of that detail from the actual die cut characters. We don't need a lot of detail in our backgrounds if we don't want it. So I trimmed this down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. All of my measurements, you can tell, are the same for all of my cards. For this one here, I have a piece of Cosmic Sky Cardstock trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat. This was the same color of blue that was used in part of that target. So I thought it would just add a little bit of color. You could also use some of the red or some of the yellow if you wanted. Then I added that very simple blended background to the card base. Now we're going to add our deer. And because we're using that liquid glue, we have a few moments to tuck things in behind. So even though I've put my little deer with the bow in his hand on my card, I can put the glue on my archery target and then I can tuck that in behind there. So it just looks like it's in place properly. The last step here is to add a sentiment and then once again a little bit of glossy accents for the eyes as well as the nose. Then we'll set that aside to completely dry. And once again, another adorable card because of those cute characters as well as those sentiments or the accessories and the sentiments. And I love that that sentiment set has so many different ones that you can customize. Now our last card here, we're going to create the last one from the set that I've been using. I can't remember if it's the Woodland or the Trailside. Doesn't really matter. So I'm pretty sure this is a porcupine. You can correct me if I am wrong. And I'm going to put him by a campfire. So for my campfire, I have some vellum pieces die cut out of some colored vellum. I'm going to add a little bit of extra detail to that vellum with some Copic markers, just adding a little bit of depth to that fire. Now, anytime you're working with vellum, Vellum isn't a great one to have adhesive with. It shows adhesive. So what I like to do is use Suquang on the back and put it on my pieces before die cutting them. That way it creates vellum stickers. It makes the assembly process really, really easy, as well as making sure that we don't see any of that adhesive on the back. So I'm letting that Copic marker dry just a little bit before assembly. I put the end pieces on the wood, and for my little marshmallows, I'm using whatever vintage photo distress ink is on my brush so that those marshmallows look like they are toasted before gluing them on the little roasting stick. Now we can layer our vellum pieces together. You don't necessarily have to add that extra detail with the Copic markers, but I do think it just adds a little bit of depth to that fire. Now another alternative for that fire is using it to create a light up card, and that is one of the features of the card that I used it for the Pear Blossom Press channel that I will share with you in just a moment at the end of the video, so you can see how it looks to have that campfire lighting, and I think it's a really cool feature. Once I have my fire assembled together, I can start to assemble my little porcupine. I think this one would make a really great hedgehog as well. I keep flip-flopping back and forth as to whether it's a hedgehog or a porcupine, but based on the theme, I'm going with porcupine. But again, you could change them up, or you can create whatever character you want with it. The other thing I meant to mention earlier is that squirrel. I think it would be a super cute chipmunk. Just altering the colors just a little bit. It really reminds me, once we got the hat as well as the shorts on, it really reminded me of Chippendale. And I just thought it would be a fun way to create with that as well. So once again, we're adding our pieces together for our character here, gluing them together with that liquid glue and then letting it dry, especially because we're using some velvet cardstock. We want to let it dry for just a little bit longer. You can see that when I move my pieces if I haven't let them dry long enough, that they don't really adhere together quite so easily. Or quite so quickly, because we're using that velvet cardstock, but it does add that great extra texture to it. I stenciled the background for this card because I thought this would be cute as like a lakeside campfire. So I'm using some Acorn Cardstock for my mat here. It's trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My stenciled piece, once again, is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And like I said earlier, I kept the background the same colors throughout, but you could easily change them up because we're having a campfire here. This would be a great one to do kind of a sunset background to add those colors there. Again, I kept them simple because I wanted to make sure the focus was on the foreground characters as well as the die cuts, but you could certainly change it up there. Once I put my campfire down, again, because we already have the adhesive on there, it's really easy to just peel that backing off and put it right onto our background. I can put the wood part of the campfire as well as add the little stick with the marshmallows into my porcupine's hand to make sure that it's positioned properly. Then I'm going to add the sentiments to this piece as well as a little bit of stickles on the lake piece. Now you can see I didn't put them on all of the cards that have the stenciled background. I only did it on some of the ones that have more of it showing. Most of it on some of the cards were hidden, so I didn't feel it needed that detail. But for the pieces or the cards that have a lot more of it showing, I did add the stickles because I just really like that little bit of sparkle that it gives, that little bit of extra texture it gives. Then I added the glossy accents to my little porcupine's eyes using a thumbtack to clean it up if I happen to get just a little bit too close. Here is the final result. I think he's absolutely adorable. I love the little bit of sparkle you get from the lake because of the glossy accents, as well as the translucency from that colored vellum for the fire, and then the little bit of shine and gloss you get from the glossy accents on the nose and eyes. It just adds that extra bit of texture. Then we have the very simple one with the deer with the archery. And again, simple background, but because the characters themselves have so much detail to them, it just keeps that focal point on the front. Then we have our little squirrel. This is the one that I think would be really, really cute as a chipmunk as well, just depending on the colors that you used. Then our adorable little skunk playing tennis with a very, very simple, just simply ink blended background. But look at how cute these characters are. They are absolutely adorable. All of the detail to them with those little accessories, I think they just create magic, really. Then we have our little fox fishing. I thought it was really funny to do the deer playing archery as well as the fox fishing. The fox obviously could catch fish on its own. And I live in an area where we have a lot of hunters, so I thought it was funny having the deer playing archery. A little bit ironic. Then we have our little raccoon with the canoe, and here is the card that I will have on the Pear Blossom Press channel. It's going to go live on May 9th, so just a little bit, but I will put a link to it in the description down below. So if it's after May 9th, you'll be able to watch it. It has that campfire feature that lights up, that twinkles, and I just think it's so fun. So that was in the light. I'll turn the lights off so you can see it in the dark. You can really see how much it lights up then. I just love that little twinkling campfire, and I think interactive cards are so fun. This card here is a 5x7 card because I wanted to have 2 characters on it. I still have that stenciled background with the trees, but that focal point is definitely that campfire, that sparkle. So that's just another idea for using this collection. You don't have to use it, or you can create an interactive card really easily with it. You'll find all the supplies that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate all the time that you do spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.